Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this unique special event. I'm Chloe Demrovsky, President and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International, joined by Harvard University's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative Associate Director, Eric J. McNulty, and by DRI International's own Chief Knowledge Officer, Lyndon Bird. We are talking to you today live from DRI2022, the Business Continuity Conference at the Planet Hollywood Resort in Las Vegas, Nevada. So we appreciate you joining us in this new and unique environment. For the resilience community and executive leadership across all industries, the pandemic has become the seminal challenge of their careers. Today, for this special LinkedIn Live event, we will discuss key findings from joint research conducted by DRI International and Harvard's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, NPLI. Findings were published in a pair of reports titled COVID-19, an analysis of leadership styles and outcomes, and Leading Through COVID-19, a meta-leadership analysis. The goal of this project was to conduct research and produce information of use to the resilience profession, decision makers, and the public at large for better understanding crisis leadership best practices as they have been shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. I am also looking at the comment stream in front of me, so feel free to ask your questions as we go. So I will start first with Eric, our guest here at DRI. First, please tell us a little bit about yourself and Harvard's NPLI, as well as your goals for this research.
Chloe, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. The NPLI has been around for almost 20 years now. We've been researching and teaching about leaders in crisis situations. When high stakes, high pressure incidents happen, what works, what doesn't, how do you get better at it? We're a joint program of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard School of Government. And we brought together this research, and we look very much at the human factor. So we're looking at this, we are looking very much at leading the event, looking at the psychology, the neuroscience, some of the organizational behavior, those aspects of it, which is why it was so great to be able to partner with DRI, because you bring a very complementary perspective. It was a pleasure to work with Lyndon and his team throughout this. And we really took away some, we thought were some interesting findings, because as you mentioned, this is an unprecedented event in our lifetimes. And for so many people, the scope, the scale, the duration of this event has really been challenging. And so to be able to talk to different organizations across sectors and see what were the common themes, what were some common challenges, what can we learn going forward? Because I think one of our aspirations for this research was that for all there are individual after-action reviews within organizations, there's not enough sharing across those boundaries. And we're very much about crossing boundaries. The meta-leadership framework we use, the person, the situation, and connectivity, that last dimension of connectivity, is so important to understanding how organizations can better prepare for whatever comes next.
Yeah, it is true that you say that we have not seen anything like this in our lifetimes. I'm thinking back to the early days of the pandemic, and when we closed our offices, on my way out of the office, I grabbed the copy of John Barry's The Great Influenza about the Spanish flu, because I had ordered it like 2 years prior and hadn't had a chance to read it yet. And I thought, I might want this one, because that was the reference point, It's kind of crazy. So thank you for being with us today, Eric. Lyndon, I'd also like you to please tell us a little bit about yourself, as well as DRI's Future Vision Committee, this was part of that committee's work, and your goals for the report.
Okay, thanks, Chloe. Like Eric, I'm delighted to be here today and be able to work with Eric and his team on this. My role at DRI is Chief Knowledge Officer is to bring together our knowledge that we have in aspects of resilience and trying to put them together in a coherent framework of ideas and thoughts. We do such analysis for trying to get trends, understand trends in our industry, predictions of where resilience may go and where we need to follow it. And in addition to that, some ad hoc academic and research work, which is absolutely perfectly the work we're doing with the NPLI. So that's what we were doing. My objectives from the report was actually very, very similar to which Eric has said, with one perhaps additional factor, which is, of course, our professional certificate holders are people who do this for a living. This is essentially why they exist in their roles. So it was very important for us to understand how effective the things we've been actually saying for the last 2 or 3 decades really were when you had a crisis of this magnitude, one which perhaps none of us actually ever thought we'd really be able to put our ideas into practice to this level. And we wanted to see if they worked, we wanted to see how effective our practitioners had been, we wanted to see how we could improve for the future. So I think those were what our goals were. So it was again, as Eric said, very much about leadership, style of leadership.
Thank you, Lyndon, for that. I just wanted to be sure, I got one comment from the audience that maybe the mics from our two speakers were not working quite well. I just want to make sure that we can in fact hear them. So Lyndon, let's start with you. What are a couple of main takeaways for practitioners specifically from this account? Because we wanted to look at leadership from all angles, but especially the practitioner viewpoint.
There are a few things that we always say. Whenever anyone has any sort of crisis they're dealing with or has an exercise, I think there's always a few things that we always say are going to be key. And it was very interesting to see that even in this level of disaster, what we've not envisaged, these things were at the fore again. First thing was, and we always talk about situational awareness, knowing what is going on, having the correct way of obtaining that information quickly. But on this one, we realized that situational awareness wasn't just knowing what was going on, it was understanding what was going on and understanding what the effect of that was on our organization, the people within it. So we needed to just know more than just what the facts were, even though they were difficult enough to get in the early stages. Had to understand how those facts were being interpreted and how it was affecting the behavior of people. So I think that extension of the idea of situational awareness was the key takeaway for me. Another thing we always talk about is communication. But again, this demonstrates how quickly we needed to get everyone on board. The conventional way of having a crisis management team, perhaps who just worked out who needed to know what and talk to them, was not appropriate in this situation. What we needed to do was to get everyone on board and to understand where we're going. Not everyone to make every decision, everyone to be moving in the same direction very quickly. That was important. So speed was important. And then the most important of all to me was, and this came over very strongly as we conducted the work, was that the organisation that succeeded, I think the best were those who were very clear in having a very strong corporate mission, corporate values, which they demonstrated that they actually used and lived with. So it wasn't a question of talking the talk, but really walking the walk. And those that demonstrated that how they behaved were very consistent with how they said they would behave in a crisis, really was a very important takeaway for me.
Yeah, that's very interesting. When we think about the fact that we did not have information so early on, it wasn't even clear what the facts were, and this is even not even taking into account misinformation, right? It's just that we didn't know anything. And I think back to there's a great report that comes out of Edelman every year called the Trust Barometer, and one of the key messages that comes out there is that the institution that we trust the most is our employer, which means that resilience professionals, continuity professionals, those crisis leaders from our organizations become more essential than ever because we're going to them as the most trusted messenger. And I think this report really underlines that. So thank you for that. And as we mentioned, there were actually two different versions of the report. We have the DRI version and the NPLI version. And so the NPLI version had a little bit of different conclusions, Eric, right? First, I want you to explain the concept of meta leadership for our audience and touch on how some of your main takeaways may have been the same or different from DRIs.
Certainly. Meta leadership is the framework we use both to teach leadership in our executive education programs and also to do analysis and research around it. And by meta, the prefix META, we mean taking the broad view and looking at the larger system. Who are all the stakeholders involved? What are the various facets of activity you have to undertake? And making sure that leaders are aware of that broader picture and not just doing the nuts and bolts of the response, for example. And so we used that going in, and that was how we looked at things. And I'm going to start with connectivity, actually start from the back. What Lyndon said was very important, was one of the takeaways for us was that just as organizations had to push apart with work from home and distancing and making manufacturing and warehouse facilities, for example, safe for workers during this incident, they also had to bring them together. They had to bring them together psychologically, they had to bring them together through values, finding new ways of communication. I found it very interesting that one of the organizations we spoke with, it was the first time they had put the entire organization onto a single platform so they could talk to each other and meet. And when they did town halls with the CEO, they had actually a very large percentage of the organization show up to want to participate. And I think across the board we saw that expectation of CEO accessibility and being able to not just put out the memo or have some sort of broadcast message, but actually be there as a human being and be able to interact and be empathic. And that was so important there. And I also think, the people we train through our executive education programs also do this for a living. And so they were, to some extent, better prepared than the rest of the organization. However, I think what this incident brought out and what we heard in the research was the importance, two things. One is that everyone needs to be prepared to be a crisis leader if you're in a leadership position now. You can't just bring up business continuity and say, oh, something happened, go fix it. You need to be part of that. And so in that sense, business continuity can provide some connective tissue across the organization. And I remember one organization that we talked to through the research, which I thought was really interesting, said that one of their best accomplishments was that they weren't running the response. They were able to step back and be more of an advisory role. And the people in the business units and the functional units, they were actually knew this well enough that they were actually carrying out what needed to be done, which meant business continuity professionals were advising and coordinating, not having to go in and again, sort of pull the levers themselves. And to me, I have to a great maturity around this function within the organization.
Yeah, that's amazing, because it really speaks to the role of that professional as being the connector and the one who has the information. And I do think it's really interesting that, in this time we really tried to find our shared humanity, right? And that was maybe not always comfortable for senior leaders who were used to being very professional and having everything go through a few layers of approval and being cleaned up. It needs to be more authentic than that. I think authenticity is a really important word, and something that we've learned about is extra important for people during a crisis. I'm curious to hear from each of you, what was a surprising conclusion that was reached, or something that you maybe didn't quite expect? Perhaps there's an anecdote that stood out for you that you can share with us. Lyndon, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that were surprising in the perhaps in the speed that they happened rather than the inevitability in the long term. And one of the things that really surprised me was how quickly people took on board at the senior and at the top level of an organisation, understood that this was this was going to affect people's mental health. Now, as we've now 2 years into it, there's been numerous studies and the press and everything is talk about the mental health issues. This doesn't seem surprising at all. But to me, it seems surprising that an organisation, normal commercial businesses that were just operating one day normally, trying to make a profit and operate in a normal business way. We're not exactly going to be normally thinking about, well, how do we make decisions and what effect does that have on our people's health? And yet, very quickly, this was picked up, much quicker perhaps than you would have expected, that the people were going to be psychologically damaged by this, that people are going to actually be physically frightened, and that the decisions had to be made, had to be taken in the context of that. And we found that some of the organisations picked this up quicker than others, and those that picked it up quicker, I think, on balance, had a more successful relationship with their total organisation. So to me, it was surprising how quickly this concept of psychological damage, fear, and how it would affect people, and that they as an organisation had a responsibility to do something about it, not just this is something that happened. So that surprised me. And another thing, I guess, that related to it was how quickly organisations reacted to making decisions on a different basis. Everyone normally makes their business decisions on meeting the objectives and the goals and whatever their business plans say. But suddenly people are having to say, well, actually, does that really matter? There are other things that matter more. And one of the quotes that I really liked from what we heard, and I suppose you could say it's anecdotal, but it actually is, I'm sure, 100% true, was the senior manager who was in a meeting with the chief executive, and very, very early in that, when the financial director or the head of finance said, well, how much can we afford to spend in terms of the measures that we can take in terms of people working from home or not working at all? And the answer from the chief executive was, I don't care what it costs, just get it done. We must be doing the right thing in this situation by our people. And that level of sort of the point I made before about tying your behavior to your defined values, I think was very critical to me. So those are things that really stuck out for me.
Yeah, certainly. I know you've been having conversations about this very recently on mindfulness and mental health. So I'm sure you have some similar thoughts as well as maybe different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about this prolonged event we've all been through is that, typically you find those who are responding and those who are being responded to, as it were. So when I deployed down the Deepwater Horizon or into New York and New Jersey after Sandy, there was clearly a response community and affected community. In this incident, we were all part of the affected community, and in some ways we were all responding. Some were responding at work, some were responding at home, some were responding, helping with school and other parts of the community. And so we were all deeply enmeshed in this. And so it did bring out both the common humanity, and I was like Lyndon, very much taken by we heard not just from one company, but several companies where the CEO just said, we say our people are our most important asset. We're going to take care of our people. Go do it. We're not waiting for the business case. I'm not looking for you to figure out all the numbers yet. Go do it. And so that was really good. It was very gratifying and a good, positive surprise to see people living into their values. Absolutely essential. A couple of the other things that I found interesting and a bit surprising. One was one of the organizations said the smartest thing they did, the best decision they made during all of this, was to immediately go 100% digital with their information. They built an app. On that app, they had information they found credible from outside sources, so CDC, WHO, others. They said, okay, here's as an organization, here's what we think is credible, which helps with information and disinformation. Here are the policies and procedures we expect you to follow. Here's how you report your status. Here's how you ask questions. And they connected every employee in the organization that way, which I think, again, was a leap forward. And I know this particular company, so I know they've done other things, app-based training around health and safety, but they really were all in, which I think was the way we're going to be going more and more and getting the information out there. And then I thought one of the other things that was surprising to me, and maybe this is going to spend as much time in your world as I work with leadership, were some of the secondary and tertiary challenges in the response. I remember one organization saying, we had in our plan that if we have to work remotely, we're going to get more laptops. Well, you can't just run down to the corner store and buy laptops. First of all, they have to make sure they're there, but then when you get them, you have to get them ready for your network, and there's a whole process and procedure that goes through. So I think to me there, the lesson is to, as you're looking at your response plans, is to be thinking through. It's nice we say, quick line here because we're doing an exercise, but what does that mean at a deeper level? What actually has to be true for us to be able to carry this out? And because again, if you're going to make that pivot, you've got to be able to think through how you operationalize that pivot. How do you actually make it come to life? And so there was a real connection there between what you say and what you do and how you carry it out. So that was good. And I think the last thing I will say in terms of the surprises or the takeaways we had were around how organizations learn. So in some cases, there were what we call a single loop learning, where people would try something, see if it worked, adjust it. But it was fairly linear and fairly tactical. And others who learned we call double loop learning, of actually going to the point where it questioned their assumptions about how they did things. So one organization mentioned that they traditionally have been very deliberative in their decision-making process. And they realized they had to increase speed while maintaining decision quality. And so they went back and thought through, how do we actually think about making decisions, which changed during this response. And they said they want to carry that forward into their daily business activities going forward. How can we improve speed while maintaining quality as we go through making decisions? So it caused that deeper thinking, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing. Organizations, just like people, don't like to change until they're forced to, and we had this staggeringly fast change that happened all of a sudden. And you know, the people first message that I got from both of you makes me think of the ethos coming out of like the business roundtable statement about the stakeholder approach, as opposed to just maximizing shareholder value, but also taking into account a broader stakeholder viewpoint, including your employees, of course, seem to be really taken to heart in the response of organizations here. And it's true that, like, in terms of the connectivity of work from home, if you worked for like a tech company where everyone was on Slack and you're comfortable with the digital nomad lifestyle, this might have felt like second nature. But for some very, more traditional sectors or institutions or highly regulated sectors, this was a major change. I mean, if they were supplying desktops, you're right, they had to suddenly issue laptops and get those kitted out in the middle of a pandemic where you weren't sure if, you could be in the same room or the same facility with anybody, or there would be major, major concerns. So, certainly we've been through a staggering amount of change, and I hope it doesn't then create a period in which we don't want to change for the next decade because we've used up our change quota. Eric, I'm going to come back to you for now and say that the NPLI version offers a few frameworks that can help leaders frame their thinking. For example, there's a number of them in the report, but one that I thought was interesting was something called the POP-DOC loop. What is this? How can it help?
And so thank you for asking about that. And earlier Lyndon mentioned situational awareness, and we like to talk about going from situational awareness of sort of knowing what's happening to situational insight, to really understanding what it means and being able to turn that into action. And one of the gaps organizations often have, not all, but many I've talked to, is a sort of disciplined approach to how do we go about doing this, and how do we routinize it in a way that it's consistent, and that if we've got teams around the world or working in different time zones, they do it in a similar enough way that it becomes seamless as you go through the process. And so POP-DOC is a process for knowledge acquisition and then turning that knowledge into action. It builds off of Boyd's OODA loop, which many people know from the training fighter pilots, observe, orient, decide, and act. It goes back to the Korean War, still used to train many pilots today. And it's a way of, okay, what's happening, what do I need to do, and then doing it. And if you can do that faster than your opponent, if you're in a fighter aircraft, you're more likely to win the dogfight. Well,
you're bringing it back to Top Gun. Thank you. I know we just had a sequel come out.
There we go. Tom Cruise will be here any minute.
Perfect. We are in Las Vegas.
We are in Las Vegas. And so, but the challenge is that the cockpit of a fighter aircraft is fairly complicated, but it's not particularly complex, right? You push certain buttons, you run the controls, they have a predictable response. Yes, you have weather. Yes, you have your opponent. If you're in a major incident, be it a mass casualty incident or the pandemic, there's a lot more complexity involved. So, okay, how do we update that tool for that to be able to use by folks who are in a leadership position, be it in an emergency operations center or just in a corporate setting? And we went and looked at what are the cognitive factors here? What do we know about psychology and neuroscience that can inform how we humans do this at our best? And that's where we came to POP-DOC. So the first P is perceive. Not observe, which is more passive, but perceive. Actively sort of open your aperture and begin to bring in data. What information can I bring in? Once you perceive, you then go to orient, which is, what does this mean? You're looking for patterns. And our brains are natural pattern-seeking machines. This is how we get through the day, as our brains get stimuli, they find patterns, and it tells you what to do. So you're orienting. What's the meaning here? Once you begin to see a pattern, patterns tend to repeat. So you can then go to the second P of predict. If this is the pattern I'm seeing, what can I predict is likely to happen next? And as a leader in a crisis situation, it's really important to be anticipating and trying to get one step ahead of what's happening and not be reactive and one step behind. So you begin to generate some predictions. You can put some probability against those. You can begin to look at best and worst case scenarios, that kind of thing, and begin to think about what's going to happen next. Again, because your incident management people, they're worrying about today. As a leader, you're going to be thinking about today's taken care of and what's coming tomorrow, next week, next month. From that, it's sort of done in a figure eight. The POP is one side. Once you predict, then you've got to make some decisions. If you think this is going to happen, who do I need to have ready? What resources are they going to need? What decision-making authority do I have to delegate? Those kinds of things. You tee up your decisions. That's the D. The O in DOC is operationalize. What's it going to take to carry it out? Like the laptop example we just mentioned. great, we've decided we're going to work from home, we're going to procure laptops. Well, what do we have to do? The people have the spending authority to get it, that they have a resource for that, we have to get it on the network, all those things. And then the C is communicate. One of the things we always find is a shortfall in any incident we've examined at the NPLI, from terror attacks to natural cause disasters to industrial accidents, is a breakdown in some form of communication, be it external with the media and external stakeholders, be it internal, just be it interpersonal. So reminding people to communicate. Once you've made a decision, people need to know where you're going, what's their role in it, how are you going to carry it out, and then you go back around to the top again. Mm-hmm. Here we did this, we made decisions, we took action. What changed? Was it what we expected to have happen or not? So reperceive, reorient, and go back through again. And that cycle, again, it's a way of formalizing in 6 steps how we as humans do it when we're at our best. This is how doctors diagnose people and decide what tests to run and treatment patterns of treatment. It's what meteorologists do in many ways in predicting the weather. And it gives people a way to think about it. And again, if you're running a staff meeting, you're running a meeting in your EOC, you're pulling together your crisis team, you can use that as a structure for a meeting, or as individuals, you can go through it very, very quickly in your head. And it just helps people think through and have some island of certainty amidst the chaos of how do I make sense of what's happening, even when I don't know a lot. And that was very important in this incident, where it took quite a while for us to really understand what is this virus, how does it act, what are the precautions that make sense, which ones don't, et cetera.
Yeah, it reminds me of the importance of training, right? You have to think through these things in advance and all of the different steps, and it's important to have a few frameworks in your pocket that you've tested and exercised again and again, so when you're actually in an active incident response, that you have that training to fall back on, so that you are more competent and more comfortable leading through any sort of challenge. Just a reminder to anyone who's tuning in with us, if you want to put some questions into the comments, we can sort of address them as we go, so feel free to think of your questions. I want to go back to Lyndon and ask you about what is the most important lesson learned that leaders should implement moving forward to help us move on today and better respond to the next one, because there will be a next one. No pressure to get the most important, by the way.
Well, it's interesting because nothing really to do with this specific crisis, but one of the things I've always quoted to people throughout most of my business continuity career, which is now into the 3rd decade, it is your former president's comment about warfare, which, and I'm talking about President and General Eisenhower, who made the comment about planning and said that essentially in battle, plans are not really of any use to you, but the planning is indispensable. And that seems to me where we've got to now in this one. Essentially, we can write as many plans as we like, but it's not actually the plans that matter, it's the people that are going to actually implement and put these plans into action. And so, to me, the lesson that we have to learn is that we can't restrict our planning to specific scenarios or to even to specific limits. We can't say, well, we'll assume it won't be any worse than this, because we don't know. What we have to do is we have to train people. We have to ensure that people are aware of what they can and cannot do, what their roles are, how they can work together. But we've then got to make people free within that framework to be able to actually react very, very quickly to the changing situation and the circumstances. And you could say, well, that's common sense, they will anyway. Actually, they won't. The more they're trained, the more they're aware of what possibilities are there, the more they go through rehearsals and exercises, not necessarily the exact scenario, or maybe not even very close to it, but the more they do that, the more they will be able to do what Eric says which is almost instinctively know what is the right thing to do and how to deal with that. So that, I think, is something that we've known for a long time, but we need actually to make sure that in our training as an organization and in the managers and the senior managers we talk to, that they understand that this is not about filling in forms, ticking boxes. It's not about compliance. It's not about regulatory requirements. It's actually about survival, and it's about empowering people to be able to make the decision they need to do in a structured and sensible way, but not waiting for 5 levels of management to sign off everything. But that can cause chaos. So it would just cause chaos and anarchy if everyone could just decide anything. So you've got to have structure to it. You've got to have the planning and the thinking behind it, but you haven't got to be following the letter. And so that, to me, I think is something we need to understand for not just for pandemics, although we'll be having more pandemics as well. And they'll be different. They won't be the same responses needed. They'll be different. But we have many other issues. Every day there is something in the news that potentially could escalate to being a major problem for a wide scale of many organizations, many people. We have to be able to deal with those. So to me, in response to your question, I think the lesson to me is people. It's the people that will make your companies work and get through these problems. And I'm been a big believer over many years of the soft issues about response, about recovery, are much more important in many ways than the technical issues. Eric's point is, yes, you've got to know how you can actually get these PCs and who's going to actually be able to install them, how are you going to get them on the network. That is, of course, equally essential. But to me, fundamentally, it's about how people respond. At the end of the day, it's still people who are going to get them on the network.
That's right.
And they've got to know they can, or how, or whatever. So it's about people to me. And without wishing just to quote from the report, I think one thing really struck me. One quote was fantastic from a high-tech company and a project management organization. And this said, sometimes we drift away from our people and we focus on profits, technology, R&D, and the other good stuff. This has reminded our senior management about how critical our people are. The executive team now understands that if you look after your people, they will then look after your organization. So I think, to me, that a piece of philosophy, but I think it's actually a great lesson. I think everybody should work with that. And I suspect that this will influence management thinking in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think the human instinct is really fight or flight in a crisis, but through training we can actually learn new instincts for how to remain calm under pressure and to lead through tremendous uncertainty. I assume you want to jump in with a lesson learned as well, Eric.
I wanted to jump in, and I wanted to build on what Lyndon just said. I think it's important. I think that it is, too often I've been in exercises or trainings, and there's someone with a placard that says CEO or CFO on it because that person, the real person, is too important. It's too busy to show up for the exercise.
Yeah.
That, to me, it should be articulated as a corporate risk. If you have senior executives who actually haven't gone through and experienced not just the nuts and bolts of what gets done, but to build trust in the team that's going to be doing that, to experience the emotional stress of a crisis situation. If they may be really good at rolling out product or thinking of new ideas. If they haven't had to make a life and death decision, you don't want them learning how good or bad they are at that in the moment when there actually is life on the line. You want people to get through that and learn about that ahead of time. And so I think it is. If you've got the right people, you've invested in developing them, you've built trust-based relationships, they will figure out how to get the stuff done. Absolutely. But it requires an organization where you've delegated authority, you've delegated decision-making power, you've developed them as leaders, and you, again, as a senior executive, are actually at times willing to be led by people who are more junior to you because they're the right people in the moment. And that can be hard for some people, but I've seen elected officials, I've seen C-level executives who understand that, and they're like, okay, what do you need me to do? How can I be most helpful right now? They don't feel the need to come in and tell everybody what to do, disrupt that operating rhythm. And so it takes, I think, in a crisis situation, as a leader, you've got to have great confidence and great humility simultaneously. Because you want to have confidence you'll get through it, that your team is the right team to pull you through it, but also respect for the threat you're facing. And say, okay, we've got to take this seriously. And yes, I don't know everything. How do we get through it? And that, to me, those people are the most effective crisis leaders.
Totally. You have to let your people help you look good.
That's right.
We've got some great questions coming through from our audience, so I want to get to some of those. So from John Ormstead, we have the question, how do we ensure we don't move backwards? Will it not be too easy for most people to just get past this moment? Can you address crisis fatigue?
Do you want to take that? You want me to?
Well, I can make a quick start on that, and I'm sure Eric will jump in. This has been a concern that I've had because I've been in this business for a very long time, and I remember, should we say, the 9/11 situation. I remember, the financial crisis that we had, and the collapse and Lehman Brothers, and each of these different situations, people said, we've learned from that. These things will never happen again. We understand that. And very quickly afterwards, although we obviously observed some lessons, we made some changes, but very quickly after that, the idea that there were fundamentally things that we could learn and change tended to drift away. This has worried me that this will happen in this. I understand that psychologically it has affected a much wider range of people. But still fundamentally, it was a shock. It was a massive shock. But so was 9/11, so was the financial crisis, and so are other issues. And yet, we have as human beings, we have to, I suppose, for development and continuation of evolution. We can't just hanker on everything that went wrong. We have to move forward, and we have to an extent forget it. But we don't have to forget the lessons. So my worry is as your question is made, how do we have to make sure that this doesn't happen? And this is everyone's problem, to make sure that the lessons that we have learned from this, we actually have learned rather than just observed and written reports on and commented on, which is what often happens. So making sure that we actually, particularly the lessons about people, about the mental issues, about the capabilities that people have, but the fact that you can only take them so far. An old boss of mine, and this is another thing that I always remember when these situations come up, said to me when dealing with problems, he said, when you, and I was as a young manager at that time, and he was sort of a bit of a mentor, and he said, look, when things go wrong, you can assume that the people that you've got working for you will probably do the right thing. But you must never, ever presume it. Do not presume that they have to do it, because they'll have other priorities. They'll have their family. They'll have other issues that they need to prioritize. You might assume they want to work for 24 hours a day to sort this problem out. They may not be able to. They may not want to. Don't presume it. Make some assumptions, but don't presume it. And that has always stuck with me throughout my career, not just in business continuity, but in management in general. So
trust but verify.
That to me is. So I haven't very well answered the question, so I'm sure that.
We'll leave that to Eric.
More for that, but to me, as a piece of philosophy, I think that's absolutely right. We need to make sure that what we have observed, we actually do something about.
And now for the answer.
And I think, I'll build on what Lyndon's excellent launch into this. I think the thing we need to do now is ask the question of when were we at our best during this event? So we don't just look at the negative, don't just look at, yes, we're tired of wearing masks, yes, we're tired of working from home, all that. When were we at our best? We were at our best learning and figuring out a problem. We were at our best taking care of each other. We were at our best figuring out there were mental health challenges we had to address among our workforce. We were at our best solving various operational challenges. When you look at that positive spin on it, those are things you want to carry forward. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes less about fatigue and a drain on your energy. It's more of an injection of, we did some things really well despite some really horrible circumstances. So let's build on that and carry that forward. And that will go, yes, we will be tired of pandemics. We'll be sick of it. We'll be thinking of the next problem. I know I wrote a column on MERS for Strategy and Business 3 or 4 years ago when MERS was popping up. Okay. I think it was my least read column I've ever written. I said, people weren't thinking of public health crises. That wasn't on their agenda, and maybe they should have been. But we get tired of the individual incident. What we've got to be thinking about is how were we as an organization? How were we as a team? When were we at our best? That stuff you have a natural incentive to want to carry forward.
Yeah, and they certainly say that the cadence of pandemics may well pick up as we start to push into the further out into nature with climate change and so on and so forth. So we can't expect that the next one will be, 100 years from now,
Right.
like with the Spanish flu. And people are tired of it, and it's a challenge we'll have to work through. We have another question all the way from down under in Australia. Rod Crowder is asking, were there any observations from the survey on the effectiveness or otherwise of continuity plans, and what are the key areas for improvement in them that were identified?
I think that from my read of all the interviews, and having sat in all the interviews, it was much of what Lyndon said about the planning was essentially that the actual plan wasn't the exact plan for the moment. It did seem those organizations had actually invested in business continuity, so they didn't see it as a cost center, but as a way of mitigating risk, a way of assuring institutional capability. Those are the ones that did the best. Was there a perfect plan for this? No, I don't think anybody had a perfect operational plan for this. But those organizations that took it seriously and realized that we're not just going to face pandemics, we're facing fires, we're facing floods, we're facing droughts, we're facing all sorts of calamities all the time now, and that business continuity has to become a core competency, a core part of the muscular structure of the organization. That seemed to be where it was its greatest value. You had the right people who could figure out the problem.
Yeah, I think there's one interesting factor that did occur while we were doing the interviews was that although business continuity was involved in all of the situations, at the point it became involved differed very much so. Some organizations recognized immediately that this was part of what business continuity was about, that business continuity was about dealing with anything that went wrong that stopped you being able to function. Other organizations felt that business continuity was about specific scenarios, maybe an IT disaster, maybe a premises disaster,
Right.
but not about something as wide as this. And they didn't therefore get the BC people involved. And the BC people actually really had to be more or less knocking at the doors of their, they say, look, we've got the skills for this. We can't give you the answer to everything, but we do understand how these things work. We have scenarios that we've tested. We've trained people. We need to be involved. And then they were all eventually brought in, but some of those, maybe the first couple of weeks, weren't actually much doing anything. In fact, one lady on one of our interviews, I remember saying, look, we've got all the expertise and we spent the first 2 weeks twiddling our thumbs, not being used while the organization was running around making decisions, because they said this is unprecedented. And that was a word that came out a lot.
Yes.
I think that people saying it's unprecedented, so we can't know what to do. Well, business continuity is about dealing with things that are unprecedented,
Right.
and you don't know what to do. You know how to deal with it. You don't know what always to do, and that is the difference. So I think that for the caller, I think yes, there's some good lessons here, but the lessons really are that if you are doing your continuity properly and you're looking at it from an overall business perspective, an overall issues perspective, then you're going to be of great value to an organization. It's got to be, as both of you, I think, said, it's got to be a core competence. It isn't just something that's a nice to have and it'll work if you have an IT problem.
Right.
It's got to be a core competence. So I think it's good for those of us in our world that it gives this sort of involvement. But yes, it was a bit mixed. There were some that were better than others in involving their BC teams and their BC people.
Yeah, and I think it's related to, you were saying that your MERS article was not popular. I think when we look at the Future Vision Committee survey that we put out, the annual trends report, in 2019, pandemic was I think it was placed 13. It was 13th on the list.
Yeah.
And so obviously for 2020, it jumped 12 places to be number one, top of the list. But if it didn't make the top 10, I think we can be certain that business continuity people were not using pandemics to try to secure budget for their organization and resource. So they weren't necessarily bringing it to the fore because nobody was really interested. You would get more attention from talking about cyber resilience, which is of course very important. But that's the challenge of if something is too far in the rear view mirror, we don't think about it, and that's all about responding to the last crisis instead of the next one. We have another question. This one is from Puebla, Mexico, from Mauricio Graciano. which is the most important challenge during a crisis? Information, amygdala hijack, communication internally or externally, fear from employees, etc. And what would you recommend to work against them? Practice, rehearse?
So, do I have to pick one of those? I do actually think that that amygdala hijack, what we call going to the basement, both on an individual level as well as at an organizational level, and knowing how to get people out of that basement to counteract that hijack. In fact, we've got an upcoming podcast we just recorded this morning with somebody here talking about mindfulness and how to do that, taking a deep breath. But this is where, again, your planning comes in, because having a plan for a crisis has actually been shown to shrink the amygdala. You know what to do. And it may not be the perfect plan, but if you know those first 2 or 3 steps to take, just knowing what to do helps reset the brain, almost like rebooting a computer. So getting people out of that panic mode. And I think you say, I've got this, we've got this, we've trained for it. And having trust in the people around you, having trust that senior management has your back. If you've got those things, then you'll figure out the individual problems. So getting people out of panic mode, keeping them calm, moderating the stress, getting them focused on the problem at hand, and working well together. Again, I think it's the problem I see among senior executive teams, is they don't actually have to function as teams very often. They can come as individuals, right? They have their monthly or quarterly meetings, but mostly they're running their individual business units, and actually getting them functioning as a team so they can work well together. If you can get that done, you can get into that battle rhythm, and then you can really begin to address the problems and solve it. Lyndon, what you found?
I mean, I think all of that is really good sense. The question specifically tried to say which is the most important, and I think that the question is a fair question, but I don't think it's possible to give a sensible answer to it, because essentially they all go together. But what do you do about it? And exercising, to me, is an absolutely key thing. And many of the people that we spoke to in our surveys, stressed that because they had done exercising, because they'd involved so many people, some were global companies that have done that all around the world. Those that had done that, those people were not fearful, because they knew what was going to be able to deal with. They may have been fearful if they'd have actually realized how bad it was going to get, but they knew they'd got an issue, and they were starting to deal with that issue even before there were any deaths, say, in the US. But they were picking this up and dealing with it. And I think that to me means that all these things go together. But one thing really is, I come back to this, whenever you do an exercise, for whatever scenario, there are 3 things in very general terms that you're always going to find as problems. One is, do you have enough information? You never have. Have you communicated well enough with people? Probably not. You've tried, but probably not well enough. And essentially, and the third thing really beyond that is, do the top management, do the top people really, really know what they're dealing with? Yeah. Because exactly as you said in response to one of the other questions is, how many times do these rehearsals have a substitute for the CEO, right, or a substitute for the chief financial officer? So often I've seen that. Yeah. So the people below know what to do better than the people at the top. So all these things come together. So I don't think you can answer the question which is the most important. I think they're all linked.
We have so many great questions and a lot of comments reinforcing what you're saying, so I want to try to get to some of them. From Ariadna Andrade, we have, in time of crisis, do you think is it okay to break operational protocols?
Depends on which operational protocols. And so I think that, again, I think many of the protocols are there to be bent and or broken if need be. I think what you want are operating principles and or values, those you don't break. So one of the large organizations I've spent a lot of time with, it's very clear. It's people, environment, and assets. You act, those are your priorities. Take care of your people, make sure we're not damaging the environment, and then you worry about the business assets, the facilities, the whatever. And as long as you are acting with that priority order, you're free to bend and break operational protocols all you need to, because we've said these are the principles that don't break. And so to me, that's the way I would approach it. Lyndon, you may have a different view.
No, I think I'm very much on that page. I think it depends what you mean by protocols. I don't think you should be breaking safety protocols,
Right.
for example. I don't think you should be putting people's lives or anything at risk just for the sake of doing so. But clearly a lot of protocols in organizations, we call them protocols, but they're actually rules that are put there for a different world, a different situation.
Right.
They aren't put there for this world. And therefore you have to be realistic about it. If you need 5 signatures on a piece of paper before you can buy a PC, well, that isn't an appropriate protocol,
Right.
if it's a rule or whatever. That the principle is good. The principle is that you don't want everyone going out spending money without any control. Nothing wrong with the principle of it, but in certain circumstances it's inappropriate. So you have to have different protocols, but you don't have time to negotiate them or discuss them or write them or get to HR to write a policy on it. You have to make them on the spot. So the answer is, I think you can bend protocols, provided they are the protocols that are appropriate to bend. But sending someone into a burning building without any protection because they think it'd be a good idea is not one you should be bending.
Yes.
So clearly you've got to use judgment about that.
I deployed alongside the first FEMA innovation team during Sandy, and they were sent out with 2 simple bits of guidance. Go solve problems, don't break the law. Beyond that, you're good to go.
Yeah.
And so that's why I get to right to what Lyndon's
Yeah.
talking about.
Make sure everyone understands your values and you've communicated them widely. It seems like a good marker. This is a huge question which we could do a whole other LinkedIn Live about, but maybe you can focus it around something that has to do with either this report or with COVID specifically. But Chris Prinsloo from Africa Health Trust has asked, what role can technology play in our resiliency at work?
Wow. Okay.
Big question.
This is lightning round, so we're going to have to go
Yeah.
quickly here. I think in a positive sense, the story I told earlier about the corporation with the app, very powerful use of technology to help resilience. I think that where it can detract from resilience is when it keeps you always on 24/7 and not being able to get off of that IM channel, not being able to put it down, and the expectation that you can't be off. So I think that using it in a way that gets us information when and where we need it is the positive. Where it can really hurt resilience is where it never lets us take a break and step back from things. And that's the shortest answer I can give. Lyndon?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by technology. But to me, technology is what made most of the things that happened possible. I mean, if we'd have had this issue 20 years ago, the ideas have been able to work remotely in the way that we did, and for us to be almost immediately send people home,
Yes.
and to be able to very quickly establish different ways of doing things wouldn't have been possible. So in that sense, technology and resilience go hand in hand. You can't be very resilient unless you've got technology. Or you can be, but you can't expect to get the responses and the speed and the things you're doing. Therefore, you could argue that the two things go hand in hand. And I've had some criticism of articles that I've written in the past couple of years where I've suggested that actually the things that saved at a practical level this situation were the ability to work from home and the ability to do things like Zooming, both technology. Those weren't the technology invented by people, but there were technology that had been invented and had been implemented. So technology probably saves us. Where I've fallen foul with people, I've said, so therefore, by people answering the basic business continuity question without realizing it, which is, if this doesn't work, how could we do it otherwise?
Right.
It's a technical solution, but there were business. If we'd not have asked that question, nobody would have thought there was any reason to have these type of technologies. So I've seen that they're hand in hand. I think that the technological solutions that we've developed to make our businesses more efficient have also been able to make us more resilient. But there's other aspects of technology where it's tried to make us more efficient by cutting costs and reducing resilience, that it can be dangerous. So I think it's, I think you have to look at it from both angles.
I like to end us on a positive note. So in our last minute here, very briefly, is there a takeaway that gave you reason for optimism? Eric.
Yes, I think that overall, the organizations we spoke to actually responded very well. Again, we talked about the CEOs getting it, engaging in a very empathic way, putting people first, taking care of each other. getting creative and innovative about how they solve problems. That all gave me optimism because we are, I think, headed for a period of sustained turbulence, and we're going to need to be able to do that. And so that actually,
I said optimistic,
well,
Eric.
it's going to be tough times, but I think I'm optimistic we're going to get through it. And that because we did see a lot of really positive human-centric responses in the research, and as we do or conduct our classes and things, I hear a lot of that from people. So I'm actually pretty happy.
Lyndon?
Very quickly.
Very.
Optimistic for me is that companies are now beginning to understand that for most people, for normal people who are not obsessed by work, that they have other priorities, and that people can't organize their business around the fact that people are available 24/7 all the time with no other priorities. I think people understand now that their careers and their home life and things all have to be part of a wider thing. And I think that organizations will adapt their way that they run their businesses to deal with that. At least I hope so.
We'll have to bring our full human selves to work. That's a great note to end on. This is Chloe Demrovsky, President and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International, and I'd like to thank DRI Chief Knowledge Officer Lyndon Bird and Harvard University National Preparedness Leadership Initiative Associate Director Eric McNulty for sharing your wisdom during this special LinkedIn Live event. We've joined you live from Las Vegas today at DRI 2022, the Business Continuity Conference. I'm excited to announce that DRI 2023 will be held in the Tech Hub, Austin, Texas, from February 26th to March 1st, 2023. So mark your calendars. We hope to see you there live and in person. Until then, stay safe and be well.